Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. I'm Jason James, and I'm just going to do the housekeeping announcements, really. That was the boring bit, and now we get on to the interesting bit. Our speaker tonight is probably well known, certainly to any of you who take an interest in Japanese military or naval strategy, Alessio Patalano. He is Associate Professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and he basically is Mr. Japanese Navy. You know, in this role, I come across various people who are experts on various bits of Japan. There's a sort of Mr. Ukiyo-e, and and Alessio is definitely Mr. Japanese Navy and achieves, I think, astonishing access to the Japanese Navy. He has a very deep links there, which enable him to. Well, you were there last week at the fleet review or something.
Yes.
I was complaining nobody's invited me to the fleet review.
We'll fix that.
Be careful what you wish for, I suppose. Anyway, Alessio has published quite widely on Japanese naval and military strategy, and indeed he launched his last book here about 2 years ago, I think it was, 2 or 3 years ago, Japanese Sea Power. So his latest offering, this one is called Japanese Sea Power, and it's particularly timely because, of course, we've just had some quite controversial changes to Japan's defence legislation, allowing it to go to the defence of an ally. Of course, the actual change in the legislation very slightly is after Alessio finished writing his book, but I think you'll find it's all pretty much on track as described in his book, so it's not anything by any means that's been superseded. So we're very pleased to have Alessio here to talk us through it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. And first of all, I'd like to thank Jason and She-Hawker for allowing me to do this book launch here. Partly, what makes me particularly happy about it is that the first one went quite well. The career progressed quite well afterwards, so I see the opportunity of coming here and do a book launch as a bit of a sort of a good fortune type of thing. That being said, though, there's always a bit of a danger with book launches, because obviously if you talk too much about the book and you're too sort of clear about it, well, people won't really feel the need to buy it. On the other hand, if you're too cagey about it or not sufficiently clear about it, people won't like it and think, like, what the heck is that? And not going to buy it anyway. So no matter what I do, the book is going to remain still on the shelves and sold. But that's fine. It takes a lot of pressure off. Because what I decided to do tonight is partly to do two things, really. One, to give you an idea of the context, the background to the project, and where does it come from, and how it fits into a broader process of transformation that has concerned Japan for at least the past decade and a half. And so really, the courtesy of the Japanese government, they were very kind, because shortly after my book came out, they decided to move on with the security legislations, and they did it on purpose, really, so that I could have the book launched tonight. So, we should all be happy about that. And what I'll try to do, really, is to set the context around which the book came about, and why and how I believe one of the core arguments around it, one of the core points that underscores it, is still very much important, because it allows us to understand, it provides a way to understand the meaning of the defense and policy security changes and connect them to the particular military posture that Japan is has and is likely to have in the foreseeable future. So what is this context? What is the context around which? Where does the book come from? One of the core ideas that underscores most of the literature about Japan, and in particular post-war Japan's defense and policy making, starts off on one important assumption, the assumption that the post-war system, the post-war military institutions and organizations were created by setting a very clear separation, break with the past, right? The imperial experience was finished, put on the sidelines, and then something completely anew was starting. And then in 2004, I was lucky to be invited to the Japanese Naval Academy, and the way it is known today, it's the Maritime Self-Defense Forces Officers Candidate School. forgive me if I keep using Japanese Naval Academy because it's kind of shorter. Otherwise, 40 minutes for this talk is just for doing all the acronyms right. And when you land there and you go there for the graduation ceremony, one thing is absolutely striking. First of all, the surroundings are quite peculiar. The buildings that you see over there, it's the original akarenga or red bricks buildings that were shaped and molded and towards the end of the 19th century. Some say that the bricks actually came from England, all single wrapped. Others say that they were built in Japan but to British specifications. Regardless of how you look at it, this is the Naval Academy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the grounds are exactly the same, every single last bit of it. And one of the striking things is that it's one of the few buildings of public institutions in Japan that comes from the Meiji era. There's very few other places in the whole of Japanese public institutions that actually uses a building that goes back the very origins of the imperial sort of times. And the ceremony itself really unveiled a series of ties and links with that past that were quite sort of striking. And so for me, that journey started really over there. How is that possible that an institution that is designed to be completely different, to be entirely separate, to have nothing to do with the past, the single most important component of its professional socialization, the Naval Academy, where the officer corps is created, speaks so much about that imperial tradition, the connection with the Imperial Navy. And mind you, that was not just about that. You start going on board the ships and you'll see that the entire sort of atmosphere, that in the small space, in that reproduction of scale that is a ship, of all aspects of human endeavor, you were not standing into, what's that, is self-defense destroyer or maritime self-defense ship. You are actually in a warship, full stop. The functionality of it spoke of that connection. So here the question was for me to really try to get a sense of how to sort of compare these two very different pictures. The one that we usually know of an organization that can be trusted and is professional because it's entirely sort of separate and distinct from the imperial tradition, and the sort of professionalism that I witnessed as I was there, and the one that I learned over time by getting access to sort of primary documents from the Ministry of Defense and the Maritime Self-Defense Forces that really spoke quite clearly of a strong bond with the Imperial Navy. Now, that's as far as it goes with the book, because otherwise it would be too much of a spoiler. Let me tell you, though, why this matters, why this idea matters, and how does that help us to understand where we are today. And so there's, on one hand, that's one factor, the fact that when you come across that reality, it speaks of a very different story compared to the one that we're accustomed. And in this respect, in the book, one of the things that I suggest is that not that all the components of the Japanese contemporary military are connected to their imperial past, but different components of it, in particular, and probably more than any other component, the Maritime Self-Defense Force, selectively entertained a strong tie with the past in order to nurture three things: its ethos, its strategic thinking, and a way it approached the sense of professionalism, how the Navy fits in as a tool of policy, as a tool of statecraft. What is the role of the Japanese Navy? Mind you, one of the core arguments, and that is the one that we're going to be exploring tonight. So the book looks both at the elements of ethos, the way the Japanese Navy tried to connect that sort of internal projection with the wider public audience in Japan, but he also looks at how that engagement with the experience of the Imperial Navy was particularly important to understand the shortcomings of the Imperial Japanese Navy and help reshape the place that the post-1945 Navy was going to have in defense policy. And this component of the argument is the one that we're going to be focusing on today. Why? Because if we sort of zoom out a little bit and we try to sort of put Japan into a broader context, there's a couple of things that are quite important. Japan stands today in Northeast Asia as one of the countries with the largest defense budget in the region. It is an important actor. If we put these numbers in comparative terms, the one you have on top of it there is British defense budget for the same year. Obviously, you can see difference there, but Japan's defense budget is not calculated according to NATO standards. If you adjust that, probably the differential is going to be much slower. Notably, for example, pensions are not included into Japan's defense budget, as a matter of fact, and that is a very important component when it comes to defense budget. Yeah. And it is not that just Japan is important, but it fits into a context, a regional context, whereby over the past 15 years at least, some would say even more than that, there has been a consistent increase in spending. Now, Japan has not increased it particularly, but certainly has remained pretty much high in terms of the top 5 spenders in the region. Of course, the top number one, the one that has been sort of investing in sort of double-digit numbers insofar as increase in budget, is China. But overall, the broader point is Japan is an important spender in the region, whereby there has been a massive increase in defense spending over a certain period of time, to the point that, as of 2012, the region has overtaken Western Europe in terms of overall defense spending. And for the past 3 years, the gap has been consistently increasing. So the first thing really was this idea, again, keep it at the back of your mind what I said at the beginning, the importance for the maritime self-defense forces to engage with the parties in order to understand how they fit into the context of national security. And that is an important consideration. We're coming back in a moment after having made sort of 2 broader points. One, Japan's national security and national security policies and military posture does matter, because we're talking about a region where conventional investment into military sort of assets and capabilities is on the rise. The second element that here should be mentioned is the one that concerns geography. In a context whereby the region is investing in military capabilities, what is striking about it, and what also makes my job very easy in many respects, is that the good deal of them is focused on maritime capabilities. As I often tell to my students, I'm the fondest supporter of the Chinese Navy. So long as they are in business, I am in business. We're all in the same business, after all, from slightly different angles, perhaps. Nonetheless, here the second important point to make is that if we zoom out even further and we start looking at the details of how that transformation is occurring across the region, one thing is extremely sort of interesting, and that is there is an incredible emphasis onto capabilities that have a direct application into the maritime sphere, into the maritime realm. Now, that doesn't just mean buying ships, right? It also means land-based capabilities with the ability to project at sea, like missile, land-based aviation, as well as all the other components that go with it. And the reason is pretty simple, because if we overimpose a map to the one on Facebook, by the way, I always have a Facebook map because of, modern young people understand that. So even, geography does matter. It's funny because even in the social network world, still when you look at a map of it, it recreates pretty much boundaries the way we know them from geography. But if we overimpose onto that picture, a picture that includes also air transportation, seabed cables, then you'll see that the maritime environment in East Asia is particularly important because it's one of the driving factors that promotes regional connectivity, not only, and also promotes the economic dynamism of the region. 90% of all goods by volume and value that are trading at any point in time in the world are transported at sea. But in particular, East Asia is one of the focal points whereby sort of the use of the maritime space takes a particularly important sort of connotation. In fact, and it's not just sort of in terms of transportation at sea, like goods and connectivity, it's also about the sort of energy dimension to it, right? So the maritime realms of East Asia, most notably the Sea of Japan, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, probably in reverse order when it comes to that type of importance. They are sort of primary arteries for global shipping, not only in trade and in terms of goods, but also of energy resources. And they do also possess in themselves they are important resources in themselves, because they include both oil and gas resources in their seabed on top of fish stocks. So from a tri-dimensional point of view, connectivity, energy transportation, and the presence of energy and sort of all sorts of resources and sort of living and non-living resources, the maritime realm is essential to the way East Asia is changing and transforming, and in that respect it contributes to understand, to explain the growing emphasis towards capabilities that can be projected at sea. And so Japan, in that sense, becomes a particularly interesting sort of case study, because ever since the second half of the 1970s, Japan has been sort of shifting its military posture to a maritime-centric balance, one in which the Navy represented the sort of front line of national defense. So it started a little bit ahead of the game, as it were, compared to others. And today, the importance, the tri-dimensional, the importance of the maritime realm has not changed. If anything, is actually increasing, because as the situation evolves and the regional economies develop, it becomes much clearer that the sea matters not just to Japan, but it matters to China, it matters to South Korea, it matters to Taiwan, it matters to Southeast Asian countries. Now, that's an example of how busy the maritime space of the East China Sea, which is Japan's immediate periphery, has changed over the past few years, and these changes are due to an increased set of activities, increased number of activities that really are connected to each of these layers, right? There's more warships going around because they have an increased interest into access to the wider maritime spaces. There is an increase on paramilitary sort of activity because of the rights and the sort of claims over seabed resources and larger EEZs. And there is also an increased sort of sense of priority across the region as to the importance to be able to protect sea lanes of communication whereby sort of trade and energy resources travel across the East China Sea. That is these days even more true for the South China Sea, where we know there's lots of tensions, and again, the core of these tensions are connected to this tri-dimensional importance that the maritime theatres of East Asia have across the region. So in a context whereby sort of the regional sort of military spending has increased, the maritime space has taken a much greater central significance to national securities. How has Japan sort of responded? What was the reaction? So really the next thing to try to engage with before we go back to the original argument about the Navy that I started off with, it's coming back, don't worry. How did Japan react? How is Japan reacting? Well, in a very Japanese fashion, somehow. I think the policy legislations that were implemented, were sort of forced through the Diet a month ago, amounted to three sort of changes from my point of view. One, given the nature of the increased number of activities that you see across East Asia, particularly in the East and the South China Sea, whereby the largest amount of activity is in a situation that is outside, it is short of a context of war or major crisis, which is the way in which all military institutions and policy making was set up in Japan during the Cold War, required an institutional change, a change that would favour increased sort of smoothness and streamlining between the different layers of the chain of command in order to increase responsiveness and the ability to actually address situation that are called in the Japanese sort of defense ministry language grey area. It's not peace, it's not war, there's just a lot of activity going on there. So it requires a much greater sort of sense of fluidity across the chain of command. So what I would say really is the first level is the need to respond to this kind of situation prompted a set of reforms that wanted to increase at the institutional level the fluidity and the seamlessness of the communication across the different layers of the chain of command. The second element is there is a growing sense of understanding and realization in Japan that for a country that is the third world economic power, it has sort of chosen to maintain a relatively sort of low profile in terms of contributing to international stability. And whenever it has engaged into activities, we think back 2001, the deployments in the Indian Ocean, 2004, the deployment in Iraq, and then again in 2009 in the anti-piracy mission, one thing strikes. And of course, across the 1990s and early 2000s, a number of peacekeeping activities. One of the things that really was problematic is that at the tactical level, the number of constraints that were imposed on Japanese forces operating overseas prevented them to actually have a sort of a meaningful contribution to the context. I suppose here the best example is the one of 2004 with the deployment in Iraq, whereby the Japanese camp in Samawa had to be protected by foreign troops because the Japanese could not protect it themselves, given the sort of normative constraints that they had. So I think the second layer of changes brought about by the security legislation is really the tactical level, to make it a lot more sort of functional for the Japanese military, if deployed, to operate alongside other sort of forces, whether the United States or in context of international coalition. I'm happy to discuss with you later on the difference between the two. Personally, I think that is where you get a sense of the clear emphasis, and more likelihood will be that Japanese forces will be deployed alongside US forces. So clearly that sort of second layer, the tactical one, has as its sort of primary objective increasing the sort of working partnership with the United States. And then I suppose the second layer, by introducing the concept of collective self-defense, there is also an element of operational change to allow for the Japanese to start considering how effectively being embedded into complex command structure, something that so far has been precluded to them, again as a part of the sort of the constitutional constraints, none of which sort of ushering a new era of adventurism or sort of ambitions to project power overseas. Most of these really are to sort of create a condition by which policy is catching up with the number of issues that have emerged over the past 15 years of already conducting operations. And I think that security legislations are setting up the context for a set of expansion of duties is just making it possible for these duties to be carried out in a way that isn't sort of more problematic than not in terms of those who are conducting the operations. So the security legislations really are sort of setting up a policy catch-up rather than an opening up of a new era of greater foreign adventurism. So what is the meaning of all of this? And that's where we go back to the naval dimension of it. Why do I believe that the changes are changes that are not sort of geared towards expanding roles, but rather to make it easier to sort of conduct operations? Well, that's because we need to go back to what is the sort of underlying strategy that fuels, that channels Japanese defense policy and sort of motivates procurement and military posture. From my point of view, if we go back to a couple of things that I was saying earlier on, and we put the specific sort of characteristics of the strategic environment in which a country like Japan has to operate, Japan remains a maritime nation, nations that lives off trade for all sorts of things, including energy, because ever since sort of post 3/11, not only the reduction of the use of nuclear power plants increased the dependency on imported oil, but even now that they're coming back online, the element of diversification still sort of maintains very much this question of dependency. Japan still depends on average about 77% of its sort of energy intake from outside external sources. And of course, the whole of the economy rests on the assumption that trading goods as well as importing primary materials and finished and unfinished goods is essential for the economic survivability and livelihood of the country. So I think that when we think about the sort of underscoring factors that drive Japanese defense policy and military posture, the question of access and trade are fundamental. Access to the maritime sort of environment and the protection of everything that has to do with the transportation at sea and access to its resources. That is absolutely a vital factor that underscores Japanese defense policy. And that connects to one of the arguments of the book, because in the book I sort of charted the development of the internal policy debates within the Ministry of Defense and the way in which the different branches of the armed forces argued for their own case. And ever since 1975, when the discussions behind the first National Defense Program outline, which remained Japan's Cold War main defense policy sort of document, were concluded, when that discussion was concluded, the idea was that Japanese defense policy and military posture was supposed to protect Japan's economic livelihood, its economic survival, had to be comprehensive, had to foster on the one hand the nature of the Japanese economy and protect its vital interests. And so the choice was made to have a strong maritime balance in a context whereby it was very difficult to do so, given the predominance of, in particular, of the army in terms of the internal political debates. And I think that emphasis not only was retained in the post-Cold War period, but actually was increased afterwards. And in what ways this is implemented? So in what ways, what are the goals, the main goals and ambitions of the country's defense policy and military posture? At the moment, I would say it's to achieve two primary objectives: deterrence and diplomacy. How Japanese military power is contributing to protecting the country's sort of core interests. One, deterrence by preventing, by making very unpleasant for anyone who wants to sort of close the sea lanes of communication or endanger the maritime realms of East Asia, which are the ones of primary interest to Japan, for reasons that I'll explore in a moment. And two, diplomacy, by using the maritime space and the access it provides to increase connectivity, meaningful cooperation with other actors in order to create a more favorable environment to Japanese interest. And that's what I would say is where I'm heading for the next sort of bigger projects. The idea of Japan in the post-1945 period is emerging as a maritime state, in the sense that a state that sees the use of military power to promote commercial and economic interests and protect fundamentally the international trading order, as it were, by preventing at the same time, by complementing this action with capabilities to allow to protect of its immediate national territory and prevent contribute with deterrence to preventing the situation from in core theatres to becoming particularly hostile and problematic. What does that mean in terms of what we're looking at today and the way the country's naval dimension is evolving? Well, it means two things. First, retaining the degree of sea control, mostly to be exerted in the Sea of Japan and in the East China Sea, something that these days is becoming extremely more complicated for reasons that I'm sure you can suspect that I'm happy to talk about at question time. And really, sea control serves the two fundamental purposes. One, territorial defense, and as an island nation, you probably have heard western parts of Kyushu and the Ryukyu Islands, and apparently there's some teeny tiny islands that are in dispute. Or they aren't, but someone else claims Right? They are requiring part of the sort of national military capabilities to be geared towards the that sort of deterrence posture, preventing anyone else to making the foolish act to try to land on the islands without having World War III to come around. And obviously, sea control is part of this bigger picture that is beyond the national territorial defence, that is the sort of contributing to keeping the sea lanes of communication open and always outside sort of the scope of reducing unfettered access to them. And the second dimension, dare I say, it's the sort of complementing the sea control nature, which is a long-standing Cold War originating dimension insofar as the naval component of Japan's defense balance is concerned, with a small expeditionary capacity. Now, let me clarify this. Expeditionary here is not intended in the US Marine Corps version of it, right? Expeditionary in the US Marine Corps component or understanding of it is, you know, you go somewhere and you blast everything out of the water, regardless of the type of opposition you fight, right? That's why they do have small carriers, they got harriers, they got the whole shabbat, right? Opposition doesn't matter in that sense. Expeditionary here is used in the British way. That is, it belongs to all those type of operations that are beyond the national boundaries and that are conducted in pursuit of sort of political choices. That means that you can do them alone. If you have to take some nationals, you can be together with others as part of a coalition. And it could also include, if you have the capabilities, also hostile entry operations into faraway distant lands. But that's not really the case of Japan, and I don't think it's going to be the case of Japan for some time. We can talk about carriers and that sort of stuff later if you want. I think what we're looking at, the expeditionary force that is designed to do short-legged amphibious raids. Again, amphibious raids is type of operations that are designed to get you in, achieve the objective and get out, so non-amphibious assaults, so not sort of extended type of operations of that kind. And I would say at the moment we're not looking at something that in that capacity goes past 500 nautical miles. That is the extent of the Japanese archipelago going southwest. And sort of more importantly, allow Japan to more meaningfully contribute to type of activities of expeditionary nature, like international assistance, as well as humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, that sort of scenarios. So what is to be expected? So based on this, what is to be expected? How is Japan changing, and to what extent that change is going to, what kind of shape that change will take in the foreseeable future? I think what is to be expected is a country that will try to retain a strong sort of deterrent component to operate in the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea, just because these are very close to home and includes also the defense of the sort of national territorial space, no matter how contested that might be. But increasingly, I think what we'll see, and it's already happening by virtue of the current operations in the Gulf of Aden, as well as the increasing interactions with partners like Australia, India, and also a number of peacetime activities like Pacific Partnership, which is some sort of humanitarian assistance, medical assistance mission that the Japanese Navy has been conducting together with other navies, including the United States Navy, in Southeast Asia. Bringing together, again, as I say, that these element of deterrence that will remain very much focused on the immediate vicinity with this diplomatic action, this sort of reaching out to countries to create a much more sort of benevolent type of environment. Some of the results of this have been sort of already providing some results. Now, this is just a small snapshot of the number of activities conducted between 2012 and 2014 just in Southeast Asia, and has been an increase not only in the number of activities, but also a change in the nature of those activities. They're much more not just about visiting each other, but also sort of taking a working level type of exchanges, and exchanges aimed at creating actual type of cooperation at the military to military level. And as I said, as of last year, not only the Japanese military was fully embedded into the international effort to fight the pirates off the Somali coast, but January this year, the Japanese also took command of CTF 151, which is the international task force. It was the first time that the Japanese did it. And again, I think what we are looking at is a combination of or an attempt to retain capabilities that will provide a substantial short-length type of deterrence function, combined with a longer, sort of more reaching dimension, aiming at promoting a broader, comprehensive Japanese foreign policy agenda. Here, one of the best examples is the Philippines, and if you go back in between 2013 and 2015, has been a sort of a consistent and systematic increase into relationship between the two countries. And of course, one of the sort of factors that contributed to cement the relationship, certainly external factors like China did contribute to that, for reasons I'm happy to explore in the question time. But more importantly, the Japanese contribution to when the disaster in 2013, December 2013, hit the Philippines, the Japanese were the third largest contingent and the second to arrive on the spot. Altogether, bringing 1,000 engineers, that's the kind of expeditionary mission that I was talking about earlier on. This was followed up by Japanese foreign policy, Prime Minister Abe's visits to the Philippines, and these days is materializing a closer military-to-military relations, and even discussions that if ever the Japanese needed some sort of logistical support to operate in the South China Sea, the Philippines would not be disinclined to help that taking place. So, by the way, if you want to quote this when you go, if there's anyone from the media you want to quote this, you go for D2 strategy. It's very cool. Right? That's the way to go. So what are the conclusions, and sort of how does it sort of all tie together? I suppose that the book sets out to investigate a very simple question that was really, how is that possible if the whole idea of Japan's post-war military sort of effectiveness has to be sort of defined by its lack of connectivity with the past? The argument of the book is actually not quite. The opposite is actually true. In what today stands out as the single most important contributor in thinking, strategic thinking, to the defense policy process, the one that the Navy brings about, that contribution is possible only because the Navy never really disengaged with the experience of its sort of imperial ancestors, but actually tried to engage with it, to try to understand what they kind of did it right and what went really wrong. And it is based on that understanding that they shaped their role within the post-1945 context, eventually becoming one of the leading institutions in terms of strategic debate. One of the examples of this was the conference that took place last week on board of the helicopter carrier Izumo in Yokohama, which was sponsored by the Ministry of Defense, the Japanese Navy, and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and it was about debating the future of East Asian security. And it was one of the largest sort of symposium. It was the yearly event. It's no coincidence that in presenting the picture about sort of the future expectation for East Asian security was the senior admiral that runs the Plans and Policy Division at the Maritime Staff Office, and it's no coincidence that it took place on the Izumo. Incidentally, it's a very nice larger ship, so it's actually quite nice to have a conference in there. So, within this context, going back to the original question that we have for today, what is the meaning and how the security legislation are transforming or contributed to transform the Japanese military posture? I would say first and foremost, really, these are a policy catch-up. Policy catch-up with a type of operational activity that has been changing and that has proven to have some substantial limitations in order to fulfill broader interests of Japanese defense and security policy. And as I say, these have evolved to include today two main factors, deterrence and diplomacy, which was really something that was not part of the military spectrum up until the end of the Cold War, and it was starting to take the first sort of timid steps in the early 1990s. But it still remains very much of a transformational process. I would not agree with the idea that these security legislations are the sort of unshackling Japanese defense policy from the constraints of the past. In this respect, I think that what we are looking at is still a process of transformation that has been taking place for much longer, and the actual implementation, or the extent to which these security legislations will be sort of implemented to promote a more proactive foreign and security policy, it's still very much unclear. I think one of the biggest failures was the failure of the government to take the Japanese people with them as they explained why these security legislations matter. And I think what in any case we're not going to see is a more adventurous type of Japan, as many seems to be feared when we talk about the transformation of Japanese defense and security policy, because what I actually see is a consolidation of a maritime strategy that underscores national defense policy and has been sort of king about for the better part of the past 40 years. And the shape it takes today is different. It's no longer just about deterrence, it's no longer to be used in case of crisis, in case there is a final showdown between the East and West. It is a defense policy that has now sort of has now come to terms with the fact that Japan needs to engage more with the international environment if it wants to be effective and succeed in complementing its own defense posture with a set of actions that will allow it to develop strong partnership, increase its diplomatic outreach, and therefore create a more stable environment in which it will be a fully embedded person. In this respect, what I see happening at the moment is the rise of a maritime state, a state that is not interested into overseas expansion of territory or ambitions of old-fashioned imperial sort of nature. This is a country that, like most other countries, understands the complexity of contemporary security landscape and also understands the limitation and inability to find a solution to all these problems by itself, makes a willing choice to try to complement its own national capabilities with ad hoc actions that will favour and strengthen its foreign and security policy in a comprehensive fashion. On this happy note, I'll stop here and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.